Today on this bonus episode of the Perception and Action podcast, how soon should you be giving an athlete performance feedback? Is there any value in delaying it a bit? What is happening in the time between an action finishing and the feedback being received? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. This is the first bonus monthly episode only for Patreon supporters. In these episodes, I will be reviewing some of the latest research to come out on topics related to skill acquisition and motor learning. If you have any suggestions for articles you'd like me to cover, please do contact me. Now on to today's topic. Throughout the podcast, I've talked about the importance of giving athletes feedback in the right way. For example, previous research has shown that you have to be careful about giving too much extrinsic feedback, lest you make an athlete insensitive to their own intrinsic feedback. It has been shown that you have to be careful about how frequently you give feedback. Research has highlighted the importance of getting the right balance between knowledge of results, or KR, and knowledge of performance, or KP feedback. Finally, we've seen that performers seem to learn motor tasks better when they have control over when they receive the feedback. Today I want to talk about another issue related to all of this, timing. If you are a coach and you see an athlete make some type of error, for example a dysfunctional movement pattern, how soon should you be giving corrective feedback? Should you jump in right away or wait a bit so that they can reflect on what happened on their own? What about when you want to just give them extrinsic performance feedback, like showing them their time on a sprint or an exit velocity on a swing? In 2017, Schween and Hegel investigated this question using the perturbed reaching paradigm, which I've talked about a couple times on the podcast now. This task involves learning to adapt to a novel transformation between your body movements and the visually perceived consequences. Specifically, participants are required to reach for a target that rotates by 30 degrees as soon as they start moving their hand. As I discussed back in episodes 69 and 84, previous research has shown that this task can be learned in two distinctly different ways. On the one hand, participants can learn the task explicitly by adopting conscious control strategies. For example, saying to yourself, "I'm just going to aim 30 degrees to the left." On the other hand, the task can be learned implicitly, where people seem to learn to make subconscious adjustments to their hand movements. Which of these two is being used can be revealed by asking participants to point to the location where they plan to aim their hand before the start of the trial. For explicit learners, this indication of aiming direction is very close to where they actually end up moving their hand, while for implicit ones, it is not. Something also commonly observed in these studies is an after effect, where when you take this transformation away, participants initially miss the target and have to recalibrate. Explicit learners tend to have smaller after effects and recalibrate more quickly because they can just consciously choose to stop using the explicit aim 30 degrees to the right strategy. In Schween and Hegel's study, the main question of interest was how the timing of feedback would affect these explicit and implicit learning processes. To address this, 3 groups of 20 participants received feedback about the distance between their hand and their target after they finished moving. The short delay group received feedback immediately after their hand stopped moving. The medium delay group received it 200 milliseconds after, and the long delay group received it 1500 milliseconds after. What was found? The overall pattern of results revealed that increasing the delay between the end of the movement and the feedback resulted in more explicit and less implicit learning. Specifically, participants in the shorter delay group had larger differences between the indicated aiming point and where they actually pointed, and larger after effects as compared to the other 2 groups, both of which are indicative of implicit learning processes. Thus, if you believe implicit learning is valuable, see episode 16 for a discussion of the proposed benefits, then this study suggests that you should be giving feedback as quickly as possible after the movement. Another study from 2017 that is relevant to this topic is one that was done by Carter and St. Marie. In this study, they examined self-controlled feedback. As I discussed back in episode 33, Research has consistently shown that skill acquisition is better when performers can choose on which trials they receive knowledge of results feedback. However, there have been two proposed explanations for this. On the one hand, it has been argued that exercising choice is more motivating and leads to greater autonomy. For example, see the optimal model of Wolf and Lufwait. On the other hand, it has been proposed that the value of self-controlled feedback comes from information processing. Specifically, it gives the performer a better ability to process and correct movement errors. To try and tease apart these two explanations, Carter and St. Marie used a really clever manipulation of adding a secondary task between the end of the movement and when the feedback was received. Their hypothesis was that if the benefits of self-controlled feedback were solely due to motivational factors, then adding this task shouldn't matter. While if it was due to information processing, the secondary task should disrupt this and decrease the benefit. The experiment involved the typical groups used in these types of studies: a self-controlled group that can choose when to receive feedback, and a yoked group that received the feedback on a schedule linked to one of the participants in the self-controlled group. So in total, there were 4 groups in the study: self-controlled, no secondary task; self-controlled, secondary task; yoked, no task; yoked with task. The primary task that participants had to learn was using elbow extension flexion movements to follow a waveform on a screen. What was found? The self-controlled group that did not have to perform the secondary task between the end of the movement and receiving feedback learned the task significantly better than all of the other groups. Furthermore, there was no significant difference in performance between the self-controlled with secondary task group and the yoked with secondary task group, indicating that adding the task completely eliminated all benefits of being able to choose when you receive feedback, which of course supports the information processing hypothesis. So how do these two studies I've talked about today relate to each other? Well, although it was not actually tested and needs to be investigated in future research, I think it's highly likely that the waveform task used by Carter and St. Marie involved explicit learning. If this was the case, then I think the two studies are highly consistent with each other. If you delay feedback a little, people learn more explicitly, while if you make them do something during this delay period, the explicit learning processes get disrupted. I think it's unlikely that the secondary tasks used in the Carter and St. Marie study would have disrupted learning if it was implicit. Previous research by Rich Masters and colleagues have used such secondary tasks to try and encourage implicit learning, after all. So, in a nutshell, I think the main conclusion from the studies I've talked about today is whether or not you choose to delay feedback to a performer depends on how you want them to learn a skill. If you're aiming for more implicit learning, then try to give feedback as soon as possible to prevent any explicit processing of errors. Okay, that's it for this month's bonus episode. Hope you enjoyed it. As I mentioned, I am more than happy to take suggestions for future articles to review, which you can send to me via email, robgray@asu.edu, or via the Patreon messaging system. If you follow me on Twitter, @ShakyWeights, I post links to lots of recent articles, so if any of those catch your eye, you can let me know there too. And again, thanks a million for supporting the podcast. I really do appreciate it. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.